Red Harvest, the second wave. Prologue. A new fire rising. The first wave of Operation Red Harvest had brought America to its knees. While the initial superbug outbreak was contained, the damage had been done. Public trust was shattered, the economy in freefall, and the political landscape torn between fear and fury. By the time the 2024 presidential election rolled around, the nation demanded change. A Republican president was swept into office on promises of national security, border control, and restoring American strength. But unknown to him, a second wave was already in motion, one that would tear the nation apart from within and ignite a global conflict orchestrated by hidden powers. The new president had no idea he'd just inherited a powder keg, and the fuse was already lit. The second wave. Terror unleashed. The deep state cabal and Chinese handlers weren't finished with the U.S. Their next move was to escalate the chaos using another 12-person infiltration team, each one carrying a different mission. These agents, drawn from sleeper cells, cartel operatives, and radical extremists, crossed the southern border just weeks after the election, masked as asylum seekers amid another wave of migrants. This second unit, Vanguard Unit 13, wasn't carrying diseases. Their purpose was terror, targeted public acts of violence to sow fear and destabilize the new administration. The plan was to exploit the nation's fractures, trigger violent protests, and pit Americans against each other. The objectives of Vanguard Unit 13 were chillingly precise. Assassinate prominent political figures and frame opposing factions. Bomb key infrastructure like power grids, fuel depots, and water supplies. Stage mass shootings at public events, targeting civilians to fuel fear. Infiltrate police forces and protests to incite clashes between law enforcement and civilians. Sabotage national security by leaking classified information through compromised insiders. The first strike, lighting the fuse. The attacks began just days after the new president took office. The first target was a political rally in Dallas, Texas, where a suicide bomber, an operative from Vanguard Unit 13, detonated himself near the stage. The explosion killed dozens and wounded hundreds, including several high-ranking politicians. Immediately, conspiracy theories exploded across social media, accusing opposing parties of orchestrating the attack. Simultaneously, blackouts hit parts of California and Texas after sabotage teams targeted energy stations with coordinated drone strikes. The media was flooded with disinformation, suggesting everything from cartel involvement to domestic extremists. Public fear escalated as the new administration struggled to contain the crisis. Across the Midwest, shootings at shopping malls and schools were blamed on extremists from both sides of the political divide. Local police departments found themselves overwhelmed as riots and protests erupted in response to the violence. Meanwhile, key figures within the federal government, still loyal to the deep state, undermined the president's response by leaking intelligence and stalling operations. The European front. A war ignited. As chaos engulfed the U.S., the Deep State Alliance, along with rogue Mossad agents, launched a false flag operation in Europe. They staged a deadly attack in Vienna, assassinating several European diplomats and leaving evidence pointing to Iranian operatives. The killings sent shockwaves through Europe, triggering demands for military retaliation. Israel, already on edge from rising tensions with Iran, began launching airstrikes on key Iranian targets across Syria and Lebanon. Within hours, Iranian-backed militias retaliated by firing rockets into Israel, dragging the region toward all-out war. Russia and China, seizing the opportunity to weaken Western influence, offered covert support to Iran and its proxies, providing arms and intelligence. European nations, caught in the middle, scrambled to maintain unity while preparing for a possible regional conflict. The war spread like wildfire. Iranian agents launched terror attacks across Europe, hitting train stations, embassies, and airports. In response, NATO forces mobilized along the borders of Turkey and the Mediterranean, while Israel prepared for a large-scale ground invasion of Hezbollah-controlled territories. The false flag operation had succeeded. Europe was burning, and the U.S. was paralyzed by its own internal collapse. Commander Carlos returns. The fight for the truth. Back in the United States, Commander Carlos Marquez, believed dead after the first wave of Operation Red Harvest, resurfaced in a small Arizona town. Having survived the ambush during his last mission, Carlos had gone underground, tracking Vanguard Unit 13's movements from the shadows. He knew that if he didn't act fast, the terror campaign would rip the country apart. Carlos reached out to Raven Eldridge, his old ally, who was now operating under an alias and running an underground intelligence network. Together, they uncovered encrypted communications between deep state actors and Chinese agents, revealing the full scope of the second wave. "We're not just fighting one enemy," Carlos told Raven. "We're fighting an alliance of them. Deep state, rogue Mossad, Chinese handlers, and they've unleashed hell on two fronts." Their first mission was to intercept a planned bombing of a chemical plant outside Houston, an attack designed to create a toxic catastrophe. With help from sympathetic elements within the FBI, Carlos and Raven ambushed the terrorist cell at the plant, narrowly preventing the explosion. But the victory was short-lived. More attacks were already in motion across the nation. Global war and domestic collapse. As the war raged in the Middle East, the U.S. descended further into chaos. Fuel shortages crippled transportation, blackouts rolled across cities, and violent clashes between militias and law enforcement became a daily occurrence. Deep state operatives fanned the flames by orchestrating fake news reports and manipulating social media algorithms to keep Americans in a state of fear and division. The new Republican president, trapped by sabotage and misinformation, found his administration unable to govern effectively. Every attempt to restore order was met with violent resistance or legal roadblocks from federal agencies compromised by the cabal. Meanwhile, the regional war in the Middle East began drawing in global powers. Russia and China sent military advisors to Iran, while NATO forces prepared for direct engagement. As the war threatened to spill into Europe, pressure mounted on the U.S. to intervene, but the nation was too fractured to act. The final gambit: a nation on the brink. Carlos and Raven knew they had to expose the truth before the nation collapsed entirely. With the help of a whistleblower inside the Department of Homeland Security, they obtained proof of the deep state conspiracy, documents linking the false flag attacks in Europe to rogue Mossad agents, Chinese operatives, and U.S. officials. They arranged a clandestine meeting with the president, risking everything to deliver the evidence. The president, realizing the depth of the conspiracy, vowed to purge the deep state and restore order. But before he could act, he was targeted in an assassination attempt, a last-ditch effort by the cabal to maintain control. Carlos and Raven intervened just in time, saving the president and exposing the deep state operatives behind the plot. Their actions triggered a wave of arrests and resignations across the intelligence community, but the fight was far from over. The war in the Middle East continued to escalate, and foreign powers circled like vultures, waiting for the U.S. to fall. Epilogue: a fragile victory. With the deep state actors exposed and many of the Vanguard operatives neutralized, the president launched a national crackdown to restore order. Borders were sealed, rogue elements within the government purged, and infrastructure slowly rebuilt. But the scars of the second wave ran deep. Trust in institutions was shattered, and the nation stood divided. In Europe, the war simmered, threatening to explode at any moment. The Middle East remained a powder keg, with alliances shifting as Russia and China expanded their influence. Carlos and Raven, having fought in the shadows for so long, knew that the fight was far from over. The cabal was wounded, but not destroyed. A new enemy would rise, and when it did, they would be ready. Because in the world of shadows, there's always another storm waiting on the horizon, and America's enemies were counting on it.